The Last Resort in a Land of Betrayal. Chapter 1. The Arrival. Jack Reacher had no reason to be in the town of Millstone, except that it was there. After days of hitchhiking and wandering, he found himself staring down a desolate road framed by brittle trees. The small, unassuming town was barely more than a speck on his mental map. Just the sort of place he liked, quiet, anonymous, invisible to the wider world. But there was something off about Millstone, something Reacher could sense even before he'd crossed the town line. The silence felt forced, and the single road into town was eerily vacant. He walked through Millstone's center, taking in the row of businesses that seemed lifeless in the late afternoon. An old gas station sat on the corner, and the market next to it had bars on the windows, looking more like a prison than a place of business. A few people passed him, avoiding eye contact. Reacher watched them closely, his instincts picking up subtle details. The nervous glances, the quickened steps, the way they hugged their coats despite the warm breeze. Something, or someone, had this town in its grip. He spotted a small diner across the street with faded letters that read Nancy's. Figuring he might find some answers with a side of coffee, he crossed the street and pushed open the door. The place was empty except for the waitress behind the counter, who looked at him with a mix of surprise and fear. "Afternoon," he said, stepping inside. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, managed to nod but didn't say a word. Reacher could tell she was uneasy, so he took a seat at the counter without pushing. After a few silent moments, she poured him a cup of coffee, hands trembling slightly as she set the mug in front of him. "You get many visitors?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. She hesitated, glancing toward the door. "Not lately," she said in a low voice. "Not safe to visit here. Or to stay." Reacher sipped his coffee, keeping his gaze on her. "Why's that?" She looked away, her shoulders tense. "If you're smart, you'll leave too." She cleared her throat, forcing a shaky smile. "Not many folks come through here unless they have to." Reacher watched her, noticing the shadows under her eyes, the lines of worry etched into her face. He leaned forward, voice low. "Who's in charge around here?" She froze, eyes darting to the door again, then leaned in. "You didn't hear it from me," she whispered, "but you need to watch out for anyone who seems too friendly. Or too quiet." It wasn't much, but it was enough to pique his interest. Reacher nodded, finishing his coffee, already knowing he wouldn't be leaving Millstone anytime soon. "Think you'd keep reading? Share and subscribe to see what happens next." Chapter 2. The Warning. Reacher finished his coffee and left a couple of bills on the counter. As he stood, the waitress gave him one last, uneasy glance, her lips pressed into a tight line as if fighting back the urge to say something more. But whatever she might have shared was already buried deep in the silence she wore like a shield. Outside, the air was thick with the kind of heat that clung to you, and a hush had fallen over the streets. Reacher started toward the edge of town, wanting a clearer view of the place as a whole, a vantage point to figure out why it seemed so controlled. As he walked, he noticed the same strained looks on other faces, people hurrying out of sight the moment he looked in their direction. A few kids, no more than 12, stared at him from a porch. When he gave them a nod, they simply shrank back, a frightened gleam in their eyes. Reacher's gut churned. Kids knew things in towns like this, things the adults wouldn't dare say. A truck rumbled down the road, and Reacher stopped to let it pass. He took in the truck's logo, painted in bold letters across its side, Millstone Collective. It looked official, almost like it belonged to the town itself, with workers seated in the back, looking as worn down as the buildings. He made a mental note. Organized crime often ran under the guise of legitimate business. Turning down a narrow alley, Reacher noticed a young man slumped against a wall, head bent as he fumbled with a cigarette. His clothes were faded, his shoes worn, but his eyes had that restless spark of someone with too many problems and not enough solutions. "Hey," Reacher said, nodding to him. The young man's eyes flickered up, then darted around nervously. "You shouldn't be here, man," he muttered, almost under his breath. "Why's that?" Reacher asked, calm as ever. The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "They don't like strangers. You don't look like someone who'd fit in." "Who's they?" Reacher asked, voice quiet but direct. The young man laughed bitterly. "Everyone knows who they are. Just don't stick around long enough to meet them." Reacher tilted his head. "Thanks for the tip." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I'm not a stranger to trouble. Sometimes, I'm trouble for the people who deserve it." The young man's gaze met Reacher's, a glint of hope mingling with skepticism. "If you're looking to start something," he whispered, "look for a guy named Doyle. You'll find him around the old warehouse district on the edge of town. But be careful. They own the cops, the businesses, even some of us." Reacher gave him a nod of thanks, turning to leave. But before he could step away, the young man grabbed his arm. "They're not just dealers. They're worse. They don't leave you a choice." Reacher took this in with a grim nod. "I'll keep that in mind." As he walked away, the pieces began to fall into place. A cartel operating out in the open, cloaked under local business fronts, keeping the town under control by fear. Doyle sounded like the person who ran things, but Reacher doubted he was the top of the chain. There was always someone else pulling the strings from the shadows. Reacher's plan was simple, as always: locate the pressure points, assess the threats, and, when the time came, eliminate them. By the time he reached the edge of town, he already knew he'd need to shake up the quiet of Millstone, set off ripples that would bring those hiding in the shadows into the open. The edge of town was marked by a series of abandoned warehouses, sagging structures that looked as though they'd been forgotten by time. Reacher approached one of the buildings cautiously, scanning for any signs of movement, any hint of life. And then, just as he was about to slip into the shadows, he heard a voice behind him. "Lost, are you?" It was deep, rough, a voice accustomed to intimidation. Reacher turned slowly, hands relaxed, and found himself face to face with two men. Their stance, the cold, assessing looks in their eyes, he knew instantly they weren't amateurs. They were the kind of muscle a cartel kept close, the kind that made people disappear. "No," Reacher replied. "Just looking for someone." One of the men laughed, stepping closer. "Whoever you're looking for doesn't want to be found. Then they're lucky I'm just passing through," Reacher said, eyes steady, calm. The second man didn't look convinced. "Yeah? Well, around here, strangers don't last long." Reacher smiled, a faint, dangerous tilt to his mouth. "I'm no stranger to trouble." The men hesitated, trading glances, and Reacher's hands curled ever so slightly. Trouble was coming, and he was ready to face it head-on. Want to know what happens when Reacher confronts the cartel? Share and subscribe to see the suspense unfold. Chapter 3. A meeting with Doyle. The two men sized Reacher up, assessing him with cool, narrowed eyes. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of distant machinery from the warehouse district. Reacher stayed still, his calm gaze steady as the men weighed whether he was a threat or just another wanderer. Finally, one of them broke the silence. "Follow us," he said, gesturing toward an alley between two warehouses. His voice held an edge of authority that suggested disobedience would come with consequences. Reacher took note of their confidence. They didn't expect him to resist. They assumed he'd fall into line, that he'd simply follow without question. He gave a slight nod, as if to agree, and then fell into step a few paces behind them. His instincts were alert, every sense on high, and he kept an eye out for exits, should he need one. The alley opened up into a wider yard littered with crates, old metal scraps, and weeds pushing through cracks in the concrete. In the middle of it stood a man leaning against a black SUV, his figure a stark silhouette against the setting sun. Reacher could tell right away that this was Doyle, the one the locals feared, the one pulling strings in Millstone. Dressed sharply in a dark suit, Doyle had the air of someone used to authority, someone who got what he wanted without lifting a finger. "Doyle?" Reacher asked, his tone neutral. The man looked up, a slow, appraising smile crossing his face. "And who might you be?" Doyle's voice was smooth, with a dangerous undertone. It was a tone Reacher had heard before, a man confident that no one could touch him. "Just a traveler passing through," Reacher replied. "But seems like your town doesn't welcome visitors much." Doyle chuckled, folding his arms across his chest. "You're right. Millstone's selective about its guests. And I don't recall extending an invitation to you." Reacher stepped closer, his gaze locked onto Doyle's. "You didn't, but here I am." "Problem?" Doyle's eyes darkened, and he exchanged a look with one of his men, who had subtly shifted his hand toward his waistband, a silent threat. Reacher noted the move but didn't react. "Not yet. You've got some nerve, walking into my territory and acting like you own the place," Doyle said. His smile faded, replaced with a steely edge. "Tell me, why are you really here?" Reacher glanced around, giving a casual shrug. "Heard this town was a quiet place. But looks to me like something's choking it." Doyle's expression hardened. "Millstone is thriving, thanks to me. I take care of the people here. The ones who deserve it. Anyway." He took a step closer, his face inches from Reacher's. "So, if I were you, I'd turn around and keep walking." Reacher smiled faintly. "Seems to me you've got more to hide than you let on. And people who hide things are usually afraid of something. Or someone." At that, Doyle's mask slipped for a fraction of a second, a flicker of anger passing over his face. He reached out, placing a hand on Reacher's shoulder, the grip firm. "Listen here, hero. If you think you're some kind of savior, you're wrong. I'm not afraid of you or anyone else. I own this town, and if you cross me, you'll regret it." Reacher's gaze drifted down to Doyle's hand, then back up to his face, a cold smile on his lips. "Careful who you threaten, Doyle. Sometimes saviors don't come with warning signs." With a sudden, calculated move, he shrugged off Doyle's hand and stepped back, creating just enough space between them. The guards flinched, but Doyle held up a hand, stopping them. He watched Reacher with a narrowed, calculating gaze, as if trying to read a man who didn't play by the usual rules. "Fine," Doyle said, his tone shifting to one of dismissal. "But let's make one thing clear. This is the only warning you'll get. You stay here, you disappear like the rest. Millstone doesn't tolerate outsiders." Reacher met Doyle's stare, unflinching. "Good thing I'm not looking to settle down." Doyle smirked, turning away. "You're not as smart as you think, stranger. Take the warning, or find out what happens when you don't." With that, Doyle and his men began walking back toward the warehouse. Reacher watched them go, his mind already working through the new information he'd gathered. Doyle wasn't just in control, he thrived on fear, using it to manipulate and oppress the people of Millstone. And if Doyle was as powerful as he claimed, he'd soon realize that Reacher wasn't the kind of man to back down. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Reacher turned his gaze back to the silent town, now cast in long shadows. He'd stirred the water, and sooner or later, the real predators would come to the surface. He planned to be ready when they did. Wondering what's next for Reacher in Millstone? Share and subscribe to stay on edge. Chapter 4. The Trap. Nightfall settled over Millstone with an oppressive stillness, the kind that weighed down the town in layers of unspoken fear. Reacher walked through the dimly lit streets, noting every shadow, every silent corner, his instincts heightened. He knew he'd pushed Doyle, and the man's ego wouldn't let that go. Sooner or later, Doyle would send someone to remind Reacher just who controlled Millstone. Reacher slipped into a narrow alley, the sounds of the street fading behind him. His destination was an old mechanic's shop, half hidden at the edge of town. He'd noticed it earlier, a place that seemed forgotten, as if it had fallen out of use. But as he drew closer, He could see a faint glow of light through the grimy windows. A mechanic like this might know something. Usually the quiet ones on the fringes saw more than the big players realized. He pushed open the door, and a small bell jangled above his head. Inside, the shop was cluttered with tools, parts, and a haze of oil-scented dust. An older man with silver hair and a pair of cracked glasses looked up from behind the counter. His eyes widened for a split second before he composed himself, returning to work as if Reacher were just another customer. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone guarded. Reacher stepped forward, keeping his voice calm. "Looking for someone who knows the town." "Figured you might." The man studied him carefully, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Depends on what you're looking for." Reacher leaned against the counter, watching him. "Let's say, I'm here to understand why everyone seems so afraid." The man hesitated, his fingers tightening around a wrench. He glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. "People here don't have choices anymore. Doyle, he's got his hands in everything, and his reach only gets longer. If someone doesn't fall in line, they get hurt. Or worse." Reacher nodded, his mind piecing together the picture. "And the police?" "Bought off," the man replied bitterly. "They work for Doyle now. Those who didn't are gone." He fell silent, and Reacher waited, giving him time to continue. Finally, the mechanic took a deep breath. "If you're planning on doing something, you better be ready. Doyle doesn't let anyone walk away from this town." Reacher's gaze hardened. "I'm used to people like him. Just a matter of finding the right way to apply pressure." The man gave a short, humorless laugh. "If you want pressure, you'll find it at the abandoned plant. It's where he does his real business, away from town eyes. And if you think you're walking in there unnoticed, think again. Doyle's men have it locked down tight." Reacher nodded, a plan forming in his mind. He'd found his target. Just as he turned to leave, the mechanic reached out, his face grave. "Be careful," he murmured. The last person who tried to cross Doyle didn't make it out alive. Reacher gave him a firm nod and slipped out of the shop, disappearing into the shadows once more. But as he rounded the corner, two figures stepped out in front of him, blocking his path. Reacher slowed, eyeing them with cool indifference. "Doyle sent you?" he asked, voice casual. The first man smirked, cracking his knuckles. "Told us to make sure you got the message. You don't belong here." Reacher sighed, glancing at the two men, calculating. "I'll take that as a yes." The men moved forward, fists clenched, their posture radiating confidence. But Reacher didn't hesitate. His first strike landed with a precision that sent one man reeling backward, clutching his jaw. The second lunged, and Reacher sidestepped, delivering a swift blow to the man's ribs. He doubled over, gasping, and Reacher ended the fight with a calculated kick that sent him sprawling to the ground. Reacher glanced down at the men, expression unfazed. "Tell Doyle I'll be paying him a visit at the plant." The men scrambled to their feet, stumbling back toward the shadows. Reacher watched them go, knowing the message would reach Doyle sooner rather than later. As he turned toward the outskirts of town, his eyes settled on the distant, dark silhouette of the abandoned plant. Whatever Doyle was hiding, it was waiting for him there, and Reacher was ready to expose every secret, every lie. Because in a town as controlled as Millstone, fear was its currency, and Reacher planned to shatter its grip, piece by piece. Curious to see Reacher face Doyle's stronghold? Share and subscribe to see the suspense build. Chapter 5. The Plant. The abandoned plant loomed on the edge of Millstone, a rusted giant under a sky thick with storm clouds. Reacher approached quietly, keeping close to the shadows, his steps light on the cracked pavement. The facility was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, but to Reacher, it was more a suggestion than an obstacle. He found a weak point in the fence, pushed it aside, and slipped through, his gaze fixed on the darkened windows and the faint glow of lights deep within the building. The place was old, but not empty. Doyle had left his mark, guards posted at various entry points, moving in synchronized patterns, their radios crackling every few minutes. Reacher took note of their routines, timing the guards' movements until he could predict their paths. As he crept closer to the main building, he could hear snippets of conversation, laughter tinged with an edge of nervousness. Inside, Doyle's operations came to life. The plant's interior had been transformed. Rows of tables were cluttered with stacks of bills, bags of powder, and an assortment of high-grade equipment. A dozen workers moved between the tables, under the watchful eyes of armed men who leaned against the walls, radiating indifference. Reacher slipped into the shadows, watching it all unfold. He knew that dismantling Doyle's grip on Millstone meant taking apart his entire operation, starting right here. But first, he needed to find Doyle himself. Keeping to the darkened corners, he made his way down a series of narrow hallways, catching glimpses of rooms with locked doors, stock supplies, and quiet conversations spoken in hurried whispers. At the far end of one hall, he found an office with the light on. A figure sat inside, silhouetted by the lamp's faint glow. Reacher moved in closer, stopping just outside the doorway. He heard Doyle's voice, low and tense, issuing orders over the phone. "I don't care if he's here," Doyle was saying. "No one leaves Millstone unless I say so. Send more men if you have to." Reacher listened, his face impassive. Doyle sounded rattled, his earlier confidence slipping. Reacher could tell he was dealing with a man who'd built his empire on fear, someone unused to confrontation. It was a weakness, and Reacher planned to exploit it. When Doyle ended the call, Reacher stepped into the doorway, casting a shadow across the floor. Doyle looked up, his face flashing with recognition, and then surprise, as if he hadn't expected Reacher to come to him directly. "Well," Doyle said, regaining his composure, "looks like you decided to overstay your welcome." Reacher said nothing, his gaze steady as he took in the room. It was lined with bookshelves, files stacked high, each detail a testament to Doyle's meticulous organization. But Reacher knew that under the veneer of control, Doyle's empire was just as fragile as any other built on fear. Doyle leaned back in his chair, trying to appear casual. "You're a stubborn one, I'll give you that. But this ends now. Leave, or I make sure you disappear like all the others who didn't listen." Reacher took a step closer. "See, I've heard that before. Thing is, people who make those kinds of threats don't usually walk away." Doyle's face darkened. "You think you can take me down? I own this town. Everyone here owes me something. You're just one man." Reacher tilted his head, his voice calm. "One man is all it takes if he's in the right place at the right time." Doyle's hand moved to his desk drawer, but Reacher anticipated the motion, stepping forward with lightning speed, gripping Doyle's wrist and twisting it just enough to make him wince. "You're not making any calls tonight," Reacher said quietly. "This is between you and me." Doyle pulled his hand back, glaring. "I've got people everywhere. Even if you kill me, they'll come for you." Reacher's expression didn't change. "They can try. But they won't find me. And after tonight, they won't find you either." Doyle hesitated, his confidence faltering as he saw the steely resolve in Reacher's eyes. For the first time, he seemed to understand that Reacher was a different breed. Someone who couldn't be intimidated, someone who wouldn't back down. As if on cue, a distant sound broke the silence, footsteps echoing through the hall. "Reinforcements." Doyle's eyes lit up with renewed arrogance. "They're coming. You're outnumbered." But Reacher was already moving, grabbing Doyle by the collar and pulling him up from his chair, guiding him toward the back of the office. He heard the footsteps getting closer, but he didn't hesitate. He shoved Doyle into the shadows, pressing him against the wall just as the door burst open and two guards stormed in. Reacher was faster, using the element of surprise. Before the guards could react, he disarmed one with a single, precise strike and used the man's own momentum to hurl him into the second guard, sending both sprawling. Doyle watched, trapped between fear and fury, as Reacher turned back to him, his gaze cold. "Tell your men to stand down," Reacher ordered, his tone unyielding. Doyle hesitated, his face pale. But when he saw no other way out, he nodded, grabbing the radio from his desk and barking an order for his men to retreat. Reacher kept his gaze locked on Doyle, not letting his guard down for a second. As the sounds of footsteps faded, Reacher moved in closer, his voice low and unbreakable. "Your time here is over, Doyle. Leave this town, disappear for good. Because if I find out you've stepped foot in Millstone again, I'll make sure it's the last place you ever see." Doyle's face twisted in rage, but he knew he had no choice. He lowered his head, beaten, and Reacher stepped back, giving him space to walk out of his own office with his dignity barely intact. As Doyle retreated into the shadows, Reacher watched him go, a silent promise etched in his gaze. Millstone was free, for now. But Reacher knew that in towns like this, trouble had a way of creeping back. And if it did, he'd be ready. Want to see if Reacher's actions will keep Millstone safe? Share and subscribe to catch the next twist. Chapter 6. Echoes of Freedom. The next morning, a quiet sense of relief settled over Millstone. People moved with renewed energy, nodding cautiously at each other, their gazes softer, unburdened by the shadow that had gripped them for so long. Reacher's actions had sent a ripple through the town, a shift that, while subtle, held a promise of change. Reacher walked down the main street, blending in with the morning activity. He stopped by Nancy's diner, where the same waitress who'd warned him looked up as he entered. She broke into a hesitant smile, relief flickering across her face. "Coffee," she offered, gesturing toward an empty seat at the counter. He nodded, settling onto the stool. As she poured his coffee, a few of the locals began to gather near the diner's window, casting glances toward him. Reacher could feel their curiosity, their cautious appreciation. The weight of Doyle's influence had lifted, but the scars it left behind would linger. He sipped his coffee, savoring the quiet, knowing that his presence was a reminder that change had finally come. The door swung open, and the young man he'd met in the alley stepped inside, nodding at Reacher as he approached. He slid into the seat beside him, his expression one of quiet respect. "People are talking," the young man said, his voice low. "They're saying Doyle's gone. Just disappeared overnight." Reacher glanced at him, noting the mix of gratitude and disbelief in his eyes. "Some people don't belong in a town like this," he replied simply. The young man smiled, a small, hopeful glint shining through his cautious expression. "People here, they've been waiting for something to change. But no one ever thought it would." He paused, searching for the right words. "Thanks." Reacher gave a faint nod, looking out the diner window toward the horizon. "This town belongs to its people. Sometimes they just need a reminder." The young man studied him for a moment, as if committing every detail to memory. Then, with a quiet nod of his own, he rose from his seat and left the diner, disappearing into the town's quiet hum of morning life. Reacher stayed a while longer, finishing his coffee, then left the money on the counter. As he stepped outside, he took one last look at Millstone. The town wasn't perfect, but it was resilient, and with Doyle's shadow removed, it might find a way to heal. Reacher knew his work here was done. Without a second glance, he turned down the road and walked out of Millstone, blending into the landscape, leaving the town to reclaim its own story. He'd been a catalyst, but he didn't need to see the aftermath. His role was simple: arrive, shake up the order, and disappear. As he crossed the town line, he felt no need to look back. Ahead of him was another road, another destination that might call for a stranger to remind people of what they could overcome. And until then, he'd keep moving, a silent force in a world always in need of someone to disrupt the peace where it hid the truth. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.